Today's daf we're going to learn is Yevamot Daf Mem Vav. This is the daf for the 7th day of Pesach. So we're going to start from the bottom of Mem Hamabet. Amar Rav Chama Berguya Amarav Halokech Eved Min Ovei Kochavim. Okay, we have to understand this concept of Ovei Kochavim is a Gentile slave who basically comes to live in my house. When he comes into my house, he converts, okay, a pseudo conversion. He does a brit milah and a dunking in the mikvah, circumcision and a mikvah, and he becomes obligated in mitzvot. He's exempt from all mitzvot that are time bound, like women, but he's basically chayav in all the other mitzvah. He's a somewhat Jew. If I were to free him, he would become a full Jew. Okay, but right now, what happened? I purchased this slave from an Ovei Kochavim, from a Gentile. V'kadam v'taval l'shem ben cholin. Before I put him through the process of the pseudo conversion he's going to do, he decides to convert himself and does it to become a full-fledged Jew. So, kanatzmo ben cholin, he's a free man. He can basically get out of being a slave by doing this. My time. Oh, what's the reason? Because let's think about it. I purchased him from a Gentile. Now, a Gentile, according to Jewish law, Ovei Kochavim gufa lo kanev. Okay, an Ovei Kochavim doesn't have rights to the body of the slave. I do. Okay, a Jew has rights to the body once he does a brit milah and converts. He's basically like my household, and he's basically owned by me. Okay, again, this is hard for us to swallow, this idea of slavery. You have to understand it came with all sorts of responsibilities that also Jews have for their slaves. It's not like we abuse our slaves. We have responsibilities to take care of them. But in Ovei Kochavim, it didn't work that way with him. Their relationship through our lens of Judaism, I don't know why exactly where they get this from, but that if a Gentile owns a slave, gufa lo kanele, he only has rights to whatever income the slave brings from his work. That all goes to the owner, but he doesn't have rights to him. Okay, what's the relevance of this? So because of that, in other words, he's not yet fully owned by me, really. Only once they go through the process of milah and tefillah for the sake of being a slave, then he becomes my property. But at this point, he's not, because I only have rights to his income. So kevan dekadam v'taval l'shem ben cholin, because he converted now on his own to be a free person, afke el shiabude, he can get rid of my rights to him. Okay, the shiabud is like he's subjugated to me, but he's not really, because he's not fully, he's still his own free person. So if he does that, it undoes the shiabud. Now we're going to talk about Kedarava, as Rava says, how can we say that? Because freedom, okay, which in this case, it was his act of going to the mikvah to convert and doing a circumcision, can uproot a shiabud. Okay, a shiabud is usually I have a lien to something. It's almost like it's mine, but there's certain things that can undo that. So what are they? We're going to say, as Rabba says, Dam Rabba. The third one's going to be Shiur, freedom, right? Freeing a slave. So in this case, he basically freed himself. In other words, yes, I had a shiabud on him, a lien, but he was able to uproot that by freeing himself by basically converting. The other two things are hekdesh, which is if I have an animal that's lien to you, like let's say I borrowed money from you and my animal was designated to you in the event that I don't pay my loan, and then I sanctify it to the temple. At that point, it's not mine anymore. And since, even though you had a lien on it, it really was in my possession, so I could do that. Or chametz, let's say you have a lien on some chametz I have in my house, and then it becomes Pesach. Once Pesach comes in, can no longer, write another good reference to Pesach today, I can no longer benefit from that, so it's not mine anymore. So basically, your lien is gone at that point. So now, Mativ Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda has a question. Okay, so hekdesh chametz and shichur mafki'im midei shiabud. They can basically override a lien on a property. That's why basically the slave can buy his freedom by doing that. Okay, hopefully the slaves didn't know this. Otherwise, many might do that. Although, of course, it does mean you have to be a full-fledged Jew, and then you're obligated in all mitzvot. People might not want that either. So now, Mativ Rav Chisda. He says, but there's a problem with what you said based on what Rav said about that if he goes and does this brit milah and tefillah to convert, it works. So Mativ Rav Chisda, Maaseh Bloria Hagioret. Okay, her name was Bloria. She was a convert. Shekadmu avadav tavlu lefaneh. As she was converting, her slaves and her slaves went in the mikvah before her. Uba maaseh lefnei chachamim va'amru kanu atzmam b'nei chorin. They bought their freedom. Now, what does it say here? Lefaneh. Now, here it's similar because it's from a Gentile, because she was a Gentile. She didn't have rights to it, and they could do it. But it sounds like lefaneh ha'in lacharei halo. It sounds like before, yes, but not after. What if she converted already and then she was Jewish? And then it's like a case where it went from a Gentile to a Jew. And theoretically, according to what Rav said, still, as long as they did it right, it doesn't matter if they did it after her. As long as they did it l'shem conversion, for the sake of conversion, it should have worked to give them the freedom. So Amarava, it's true. That Braita also, we inferred something not exactly accurate. We can infer like this. If it's lifaneha, what was that pointing out? Lifaneha, bein b'stam, bein b'mefurash. Whether they specified they were doing it for conversion or whether they didn't specify they were doing it to convert. Okay, either way, they're free because they did it all when they were owned by a Gentile. But if it's lacharea, after she converted, then b'mefurash in b'stamlo. If they specified that they were doing it for conversion's sake, then it would work. But if they weren't specifying they were doing conversion's sake and they just went to the mikvah, we're going to assume they were doing it in order for the sake of being her slave, and then they're not free. Amar Rav Avia. Now Rav Avia comes to limit what Rav said. Lo shanu ela belokach min ovei kochavim, aval ovei kochavim gufa kane. Dichtiv. Okay, so this is only if you buy it from an ovei kochavim. But what if the ovei kochavim sold himself? Okay, that's different. There's no three people here, two Gentiles, right? One sold you their slave, but you bought himself. So then that wouldn't be the case. What Rav said, they don't have a way out because it says, Gam mibnei toshavim hagarim imachem mehem tiknu. So from the people who live among you, you can purchase slaves. This is where we get the laws of ovei kochavim. Atem koni mehem velohem koni mikem. You can buy from them, but they can't buy from you. This is where we get what I said before about they don't have rights to people. Velohem konim zemizeh. That's where we see it. They can't buy from other people. Only you can buy from them. What I said before, I wasn't sure. It comes up right here. Velohem konim mikem lemai. What does it mean they can't buy from you? For what? If it means if they buy a slave from you so they can't get their income, that's ridiculous. Of course they can. Of course, Gentiles can buy a Jewish slave and they'll get their income. It says, this is a pasuk which talks about if you sell yourself into slavery to a ger. Now, what's a ger? Amar mishpachat ger. This wording in the Torah, mishpachat ger, even though ger often means a convert, in this context, it means zeha ovei kochavim. It means you sold yourself to a Gentile. So therefore, el alav legufe. It must mean if he sold himself. That's what it means. And it says you can buy even there, right? You can purchase them themselves from them, right? Even from him himself, you have rights to him, and then he can't do this. So maybe it's only once with money and with mikvah. In other words, maybe they only become yours, even if they sold themselves, only after they undergo the conversion process, right? Also by you paying and also with the tefillah. So kasha. So this is in fact a difficulty on Rav Avia. It's not so clear that he's right about what he said. Amar Shmuel. Now we get to this issue that if he can buy his freedom, then it's a little bit tricky. So not only that, but when you're putting him in the mikveh, he could immediately say, oh, I'm doing this for the sake of my own conversion. And you're messed, right? You're stuck now. You don't have a slave anymore that you actually just purchased. So Amar Shmuel, but Shmuel says when you do this, when you dunk him in the mikvah, you take him to the mikvah to convert, be firm with him, show that he's your slave. Okay, so that it's clear that his tefillah, when he's dunking, he's doing it for avdut purposes. And this is right, trigger warning. You're not going to be so happy with what you hear here, but Binyamin was a slave of Rav Ashi. He went to put him in the mikvah. He gave it to these two rabbis to do. Let's make sure that he understands what's going on here and that he's a servant, that he's the slave. So what did they do? They put a muzzle around his neck or some sort of, something around his neck to show we're in charge. Arpule, they loosened it, and then they tightened it around. Arp right around his neck. Arpule, they loosened it. Right? We can't have a chatzitza. We can't have something separating between, right? The water has to get all around his body. So they loosened it so the water could get there. And then they tightened it. They tightened it. Right? If he's got a muzzle around his neck, he can't start saying, oh, I'm doing this because I willingly want to be a convert. Can't do that because he's got a muzzle around his neck, to remind him Don't forget why you're doing this. So it's a little bit of an unpleasant scenario, but you could see why they would do it in order to prevent that from happening. And then, as he was getting his head out of the water, they even went further. They put a big pail full of stuff on his head, full of, I forget, Tina is tar or something. Yeah, right. Full of like tar, something like that. And what did he do? The Amrule, they said to him, Zil am telebe marach, go bring this to your master's house. Okay, so that you know you're a slave. Amrule of Papa Larav. Chazi marhane debate Papa Bar Abba. Did you see the people in the house of Papa Bar Abba? They take people who owe taxes and can't pay their taxes, and they basically make them their servants. So the question is, when they leave, those people that now work as their slaves, they're presumably not, they're non-Jewish people who work as their slaves because they couldn't pay their taxes. Do they need a document to release them or not? So, Amarle, Igushrive, Lo Amre Luhu Hachmilta. It's good I didn't die before I told you this, right? Obviously, says, I didn't want to go to my grave without having passed this on. Clearly, you need the answer to this. Hachi Amar of Sheshet, this is what he said. Mohorkayu dahane betafza demalka banach. Mohorkayu, there's different interpretations. The Aruch actually says it's the list of people who need, right, who haven't paid their taxes is in, right, it's in the king's, it's sitting in the king's property. Umalka Amar, and the king says, Mandalo yav karga mishtabe the mandi yav karga. Basically, he says, they are lien to the people who do pay taxes. And therefore, basically, based on the king's assessment, right, they're your slaves. And basically, you would need to release them with a get shechur. Okay, you would have to give them a document to release them. He got to a place called Gavla, which we're going to see, had people who really weren't so careful about Torah. They didn't know so much about Torah law. They were Jews, but no, not so much. Chaza B'nai Yisrael. So now he sees three things that happen there. He sees B'nai Yisrael, he sees these Jewish girls who are pregnant with non-Jewish, right, men, okay, from non-Jewish men, impregnated by non-Jewish men. That, but now it's not exactly non-Jewish men. We're going to see, we're going to call them non-Jewish men, but they're converts, and this is going to be the whole next sugya, that underwent circumcision, but didn't yet go in the mikveh. Okay, so they're somewhat Jewish, but we're going to see how they're treated. Then they saw wine that was poured by Gentiles, and the Jews were drinking it. Then he saw chazit tormasin, which are lupines, which are things that have to be cooked for a long time before they're edible. We saw the Gentiles cooking them, and the Jews were eating them. He doesn't say anything to them. I guess he came to a new place. He didn't know how to respond. He didn't know the people, right? It's a good example of you have to get your bearings before you start shouting at people about doing things wrong. On to the Kamej Rabbi Yochanan. So he goes to Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan tells him the following: Amarle, say v'hachrez, go and announce al b'neihem shem mamzerim, that their children are mamzerim. We're going to see this why in a minute. V'al yenam mishum yenesach, and that their wine is forbidden because of yenesach, and al tormasim mishum b'shulei of de kochavim, l'fisha enan b'nei Torah, and on the lupines, tell them that it's b'shulei akum, right? This is Gentiles can't cook food for Jews. And then he says, I'm telling them this because they're not B'nai Torah. We're going to have to understand that because shouldn't it be forbidden to anybody? So Rabbi Yochanan the Ta'ameh. We're going to have Rabbi Yochanan goes according to his approach, and we're going to see two issues here. One, number one, you're not a ger until you do both Brit Milah and Tefillah, which we're going to get to a discussion about this soon. See it through a machloket about it. So he treated them as Gentiles because they hadn't undergone full conversion. And furthermore, why the kids mamzerim? We already learned. Remember, we learned there was a machloket about this, about whether child of a Gentile and a Jewish woman is a mamzer or is just, right, pasul for a kohen, but not a mamzer. So he held, right, we hold they're not mamzerim. But here he says, they said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ovei Kochavim ve'eved abal ba'Yisrael, right? Ovei Kochavim were a slave that sleeps with a Jewish woman, Havlav mamzel. Okay, there you have it. The second thing, Al Yenah Mishum Yenesech, Mishum Let. Now, what's the issue of Yenesech? Yenesech is wine that a Gentile touched. You can't drink because there's a concern they offered up to their gods, and also as a way to minimize interactions between Jews and Gentiles to prevent marriage between them, intermarriage. So now they say, in this case, he's pouring it. And when he pours it, he doesn't touch it. So what's the issue? It's only if he touches it. So they said, well, we say to a Nazir, stay far away from a vineyard because you can't eat grapes and you might see them and want to eat them. So likewise, we say to everybody, all the Jews, don't even drink wine that a Gentile poured because you might come to drink wine that a Gentile touched. Okay, and this is why we're careful nowadays not to have wine that a Gentile poured. Actually comes from here. But I mean, it appears in other sugyot as well, but clearly from here. So Habnei Torah Shave, what would be allowed if they're not Bnei Torah? Rav Shmuel, the son of Rav Yitzchak, said in the name of Rav, anything that can be eaten raw, so this can't be eaten raw, so it shouldn't, if it can be eaten raw, like tomatoes, and then you cook them up. That doesn't matter. If they cooked tomatoes, they're Gentiles. It's fine. I can eat it because I could have eaten it raw. But this can't be eaten raw. So Rabbi Yochanan he holds like the other version of what Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said in the name of Rav, which is Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Mishmei Rav. Anything you wouldn't put on a king's table to eat with bread. It's not nice enough to go on the table of a king. Then there's no bishul akum problem, and therefore Tama de enam b'nei Torah, ha b'nei Torah shavet. And that's why, because they're not b'nei Torah, we were stringent with them. Normally, other people can eat these, but we didn't want them to eat it because they wouldn't know to distinguish between this, specific heter of, oh, well, it doesn't go on a king's table. So we don't want to start telling them, oh, that you can eat, but you can't eat something else. They might not get it. So therefore, we're strict with them specifically because they're not b'nei Torah. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to this machloket about milah and tefillah. Ger shemal v'lo tava. What if he did a brit milah, but he didn't go in the mikveh? Rabbi Eliezer omer, harei ze ger shekem matzinu v'avotenu shemalu v'lo tavlu. We have evidence from our forefathers. Now, when did our forefathers all convert? So the assumption is that we're talking about in the time after they got out of Egypt, just before they got the Torah. Apparently, according to this, they underwent a conversion. All the people underwent a conversion to be ready to accept the Torah. So what happens? Well, they did Brit Milah then. Okay, there was this Brit Milah that they all did in the desert before getting the Torah, but they didn't go to a mikvah. So there you have it. Obviously, Mal Velo Taval is okay. Taval Velo Mal, what if you only went to the mikvah but didn't circumcise? Rabbi Yeshua well, all the women of those days, they didn't do a Brit Milah. Now, of course, they couldn't. We'll get back to that issue. But he says that proves that it's not an essential part of the process because you can convert without circumcision. So therefore, even if you didn't circumcise, but you did convert for the purposes of conversion, it works. You need everything. For Rabbi Yeshua, so now we're going to go through. Rabbi Yeshua, why doesn't he learn it from the fathers that they didn't go to the mikvah? So why does he say you have to go to the mikvah? For Rabbi Eliezer, and why doesn't Rabbi Eliezer learn from the mothers? So let's start with the second question. Maybe you'll say you can't learn from the mothers because they couldn't do circumcision. So you can't learn in a case where you can do circumcision from a case that you can't do circumcision. Maybe that's what he holds. But we're going to prove from another source that Rabbi Eliezer himself doesn't hold that way. So, V'atanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, back to Pesach again. When you go to buy your korban Pesach, you can only buy it with non-sanctified money. You can't take money from Maser Sheni. Remember the Maser Sheni sanctified money, second tithe. You're supposed to take your fruits to Jerusalem. Instead, you can redeem them on coins and go buy meat in the temple, in Jerusalem, or anything food in Jerusalem. But you can't use it to buy your korban Pesach. Why not? Because Ne'amar Pesach b'Mitzrayim and Ne'amar Pesach b'Terot. Remember, Rabbi Eliezer is the one saying this. Ma Pesach Amor b'Mitzrayim, right? There's Pesach that they did the first year, and then there's the rest of every other year after that. Ma Pesach Amor b'Mitzrayim eno ba'elam min achulin. That only comes from non-sanctified property because you didn't have any Maser Sheni. It's only when you get into the land. There was no Maser Sheni the first year in Egypt, the first year in the desert after getting out of Egypt. Af Pesach Amor l'Derot eno ba'elam min achulin. So therefore, Pesach for all generations is only from chulin. Rabbi Akiva, there was no opportunity to have sanctified money. That's why. But you can't learn for Pesach L'Dorot, from the Pesach of the year they got out of Egypt. So Amar Lo, Rabbi Eliezer answers, I don't care that it was not possible. That proves that you obviously don't need it. So there you see that you can't answer that. So Ella, so it must be that Rabbi Eliezer does agree that you could learn from the mothers, because he does dan efshar mishi efshar, in which case he doesn't disagree about that case. They all think that if you did a brit milah, that if you didn't do a brit milah and you went to the mikveh in order to convert, that would work. Again, not ideally, but it would. Ki pligi, we don't hold this way anyway, but ki pligi b'mal v'lo tava. The machloket is specifically in mal v'lo tava. Now there, you have to explain why Rabbi Eliezer doesn't agree with why Rabbi Yeshua doesn't agree with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer yalef me'avot. Remember, he said the fathers didn't go to the mikveh. Rabbi Yeshua b'avot nami tefillah. He doesn't disagree with conceptually. You can learn from the fathers. It's just that they did go to the mikveh. How do we know? Minale, where does he get that they went to the mikveh? Ilema, if you want to say, meaning we're going to reject this one, but let's first understand it. This is right before they get the Torah. It says, go sanctify yourselves, and wash your clothes. Now, what is washing your clothes in the Torah? Usually is associated with impurity, and some levels of impurity need also for you to wash your clothes. So now, not all though. So kibus, ta'un tefillah. There's many cases where you don't need to wash your clothes and yet you need to go to the mikveh. So sometimes, right, you don't need to wash clothes and you do need to go to the mikveh. Therefore, makom ta'un kibus, if you need to wash your clothes, wouldn't you obviously then also need to do tefillah? So then they say, well, Dilma Nikiyupa Alma, maybe it was just have clean clothes. This is going to be a big thing. Go, right? It's like we're going to a big wedding. Make sure you have clean clothes. You look nice. You iron them. Maybe that's what he said. You have to wonder why the Torah would be telling you that, but still, maybe it's saying this is going to be a big event. So therefore, you can't learn from there. But we could learn from here. He took the blood and he sprinkled it on the people. Now, what does that have to do with going to the mikveh, right? Not that they went to the mikveh after to wash them off. That would just be to wash off the blood. But we learned you don't do sprinkling unless the person goes to the mikveh. This is really referring to the sprinkling of the para aduma waters. But the assumption here is that at the ceremony, this is the ceremony they did at Matan Torah, that Moshe poured blood on the people, or sprinkled blood on them. So, and this debate where exactly he sprinkled it, but let's assume he sprinkled on them. They needed to do tefillah before that. So there you have evidence that they did a tefillah. So there's a debate between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer whether they did tefillah in the desert or not. That would prove whether tefillah is an essential part. If it comes to the Brit Milah, that clearly isn't essential. Everybody proved that from the mothers, other than the rabbis who would say, no, you have to do both. Number one, they would hold the Avot did tefillah in the desert, like we just explained right now, according to that opinion. And in terms of the Brit Milah, they would say, Ein danim efshar mishi efshar. You can't learn from the women because the women couldn't have done circumcision. Those who are required to do circumcision or could potentially do circumcision are required to do it. For Rabbi Yeshua, tefillah b'imahot minal. And how do we know that the women did tefillah? Because that was obvious to him. So he says, Svarai, Team came, but he says, well, it's obvious because if they don't have circumcision, they need something. What must that something have been? It must have been they did tefillah. Here we have a psak halacha, like the rabbis. So then the Gemara says, Pshita, isn't it obvious we're going to hold like the rabbis? We have one Rabbi Yeshua, we have one Rabbi Eliezer, and then we have all the rabbis. We always go by the majority. So they're saying no, because Man Chachamim Rabbi Yossi, the Chachamim here is really one person's opinion. How do we know this? Tanya, Hare Shabav Amar Malti V'lo Tavalti. If somebody comes and says, I did a Brit Milah, but I didn't go to the mikveh. Now, we don't know, like I said, someone could get circumcised many years before now for the purposes of conversion. So we don't know if he converted for the purposes of conversion or not. So when he comes and says, I did a Brit Milah, but I didn't go to the mikveh yet, Matbilinoto, Uma B'kach Devar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, you can let him go to the mikveh because what's the difference? And we're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda holds basically, it doesn't matter if you did a Brit Milah or not. Tefillah is enough. And likewise, we're going to see, even though it's not clear from here yet, that even the reverse is true as well. You just need one of them. It's not so important. Rabbi Yossi, that you have both. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein Matbilin. You can't go to the mikveh because you can't put him in the mikveh because you have to make sure you did a Brit Milah for the sake of conversion. So you'd have to do what we call hatafat ambli, taking out a little bit of blood from there, and that then and do that for the purposes of conversion, and then you could bring him to the mikveh. Lefichach, therefore, says the Braita, matbilim ger b'Shabbat. Right. Lefichach matbilim ger b'Shabbat divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, therefore, since, now here we're going to see this is where it comes up, since it's not the thing that necessarily turns the person into Jewish, because it could be the Brit Milah does, that he had a Brit Milah already, you can actually let someone convert on Shabbat, because if you can let him, go to the mikveh, because if going to the mikveh was the moment of conversion, it would be a problem, because you're fixing a person. You can't fix, just like you can't fix a kli on Shabbat, a vessel, you can't fix a person, you can't change your status. But since it's not a critical part, therefore, you could actually do it on Shabbat. And according to Rabbi Yossi, right, Rabbi Yossi Omer ein matbilim, right? He would say you can't be matbil on Shabbat, okay? Because again, he holds you have to do Brit Milah and Tefillah, and therefore, when you do the Tefillah, that makes the conversion valid. And that's not allowed on Shabbat. The Gemara says, Pshita, Kevan Damar Rabbi Yehuda b'chad Sagya, since he says one is enough, either or, Hecha Demal, Lefanenu, Matbilim. Therefore, if he already did a Brit Milah in front of us, obviously you could let him go to the mikvah on Shabbat. My lefichach. So why do you need this lefichach? Well, because it wasn't so clear, and this is why I said at the beginning. Ma'u d'tema Rabbi Yehuda tefillah ikal tefillah b'Shabbat lo to come attacking gavra. In that story that we said, where the guy showed up and said, "I already did a brit milah," we say, "Well, we can convert you because I don't know about the status of your brit milah, but at least if we convert you, if we dunk you in the mikveh, that will work because you only need dunking in the mikveh." But it wasn't clear that if you only had circumcision, it would work. So therefore, Kamash Malam, by saying you can do that, right? And then if tefillah was the main thing, that would be the thing that would make him into a Jew, and that would be metakein gavra. That would fix him, in which case you couldn't do it on Shabbat. Kamash Malam de Rabbi Yehuda oha. From there, we learn that Rabbi Yehuda just requires one or the other. Rabbi Yossi Omer emat bilin. Pshita, isn't that obvious? To Kevan, to Amar Rabbi Yossi Pertibinin, since he needs both. Tikune gavra b'Shabbat lo matkininan. This was pretty clear. Right? You clearly can't do it if you need both. That's really fixing him. So, Ma'u d'tema Rabbi Yossi milah ikal. Maybe you would say, according to Rabbi Yossi, Brit Milah is the central thing. In that case, well, it was only because the Brit Milah wasn't done in front of us. That's why he made him do the tefillah. But if we saw the Brit Milah, if it was in front of us, maybe someone could go to the mikvah on Shabbat, because maybe you'd say, then according to Rabbi Yossi, when we know the circumcision was totally valid, for the purposes of conversion, maybe it's okay if he goes to the mikveh because he's really Jewish anyway. Kamash malan de Rabbi Yossi tartei. Then from there we learn he needs both. And that's where we get that Rabbi Yossi is the rabbi's opinion, that you need both. And then that's what we need to know you paskin that way, because it wasn't clear from just the fact that it was the majority opinion, because it's actually not the majority opinion. It's an individual's opinion. Amal Rabba. Uvda have be Rabbi Chia bar Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Matnei Rabbi Yeshua bar Rebbe, Rav Safra Matnei Rav Oshaya bar Rabbi Chia. Each one said there was another person there. So in the end, there must have been three people in this case. To ate the kamei ger shemal v'lo taval, a guy comes before him who was circumcised but didn't go to the mikveh yet. Amar le shai kana l'machar v'nizbalina. It was Shabbat, so they said, wait till tomorrow and we'll let you go in the mikveh. Shma mina tlat. You can infer three things from here. Shma mina ger tzarich shlosha. See, a conversion has to be done in front of three people. This is what we do. Shma mina eino ger ashimo v'yitbo, which also we do nowadays, right? You're not going to be a convert until you do both. Ushma mina ein matbili, and that's how do we know that? Because they wouldn't let him do it on Shabbat because you needed to also do, in order to become a Jew, that turns you into a Jew. Ushma mina ein matbilin ger b'layla, and then we see they didn't say come back at night. They said come back tomorrow. That means you can't do it at night. Why don't you say you see or you need experts, because all the rabbis there were experts? No. That could just be, that just who happened to be there. It doesn't necessarily mean you need experts. Where do we get that from? Mishpat. It says mishpat. It says mishpat echad yelachem v'lager kaizrach. There will be one law for you, the ger and the ezrach. From here you see mishpat connected with convert. From here you see conversion is like judgment. So you need three people. And that would also explain, by the way, why you can't do it at night, because judgments are always done during the day. Okay, we'll now start the next bright and we'll stop in the middle because the daf ends there. We'll finish it up in tomorrow's daf. Tanu Rabbanan Mishabav Amal Ger Ani Yachol Nikablenu. This is a fascinating topic. Someone comes and says, I'm a convert. Maybe you can accept them without any proof. Talmud Lamal Itcha Memuchzak Lecha. Okay, that's where it said. Sorry, this itcha is Okay, we're reading this pasuk in Vayikra, chapter 19, pasuk 33. If a Yagur itcha ger, with you, that means has to be some sort of proof with him. It has to be known that he's a ger. So this is a big question, right, about accepting converts nowadays. It's a huge issue, especially in Israel, but really anywhere. Whether certain communities accept conversions of other people, it's a huge problem nowadays. So the question is, what does it mean? What does it mean that you have some sort of, proof, some sort of it's a known thing? It's a big question. So what if he comes with witnesses that say, I saw him convert? Minayin, how do we know that works? Because it says with you, that means you can have, that witnesses will be sufficient. The Rashi asks, Rashi points out that the Gemara is going to ask later, why do we need proof that witnesses are sufficient? Why do we need a verse for that? In general, we know witnesses are good for anything, so that really should suffice. Anyway, this is a fascinating topic. We'll continue on with it tomorrow about how do we know how to accept converts, whether they're real converts, legitimate converts or not, right? It's a really good question. Okay, we will end here for today. Have a Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, and we'll meet up after the holiday. Again, the next shiurim will go up later, right? If you're listening to this right away after I posted it, soon after, the next shiur will go up for Shabbat, and the shiur, and then on Sunday, we'll go back to normal. Okay, have a great weekend.